chapter 11, and we're going to pick up with the story of Abel here just a little bit, and continue on down through verse 16. But let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for the time to look at your word. We're thankful for these examples of faith that you have recorded for us, and we're thankful for these men that ultimately show us who Jesus is and what you have done and what you have prepared in his life and how he lived, and then how that shows us how we should live as well. Father, help us as we look at this topic to imitate these examples of faith and to look to Jesus and to endure our race. In your Son's precious name, amen. All right, so we're here at verse 4 in Hebrews chapter 11. And one thing we did on Sunday is we talked about really the definition of faith, and we started working through some of these characters a little bit with people. And then in verse 6, we talked some about the necessity of faith, how without faith it's impossible to please him, that anybody that would draw near to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Now, a couple of things that are pretty interesting as we look at this section. One, going through and he's basically laying out that this has been what the Bible story has been about who is acceptable to him, who is commended. Notice again what he said here in verse 2. He says, "For by it the people of old received their commendation." But one thing as well, when we read the Bible, it's not just what they did to be acceptable and that kind of thing. We've also talked about how each of these different people, they prepare us for Jesus. And they tell us about him and about his life and those kind of ideas. And I want to pick that up a little bit here with verse 4 when we look at the story of Abel here. Now, this is a story that obviously we're very familiar with, where it says in verse 4, "By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him as accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks." Now, all of that is true of Abel, but is any of that true of Jesus? If you go like back up and you reread that, and you just reread the descriptions, how many of those sound like Jesus? Have you read it like that? Yeah. And in fact, I'm of the persuasion that some of the unique details that the Hebrew writer includes here that are not mentioned in other places are because they're specifically referring to Jesus. Now, I'm not the first one to come up with this. The first person actually that told me about this idea, first person that told me about this, and let me tell you the reason behind this. The reason is because I want you to read this in maybe a different light than something you hadn't seen before. But I remember I was talking about this at some point, and Dan Kingsley talked to me one day, and he was like, "Hey, did you ever hear this lecture by Jason Longstreth?" And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to lecture to you. You can go through and read it for yourself, hear his argumentation. But what he was talking about is he went through all of these different people, and not only talked about who they were in the past, but how they set us up and prepare us for Jesus. And so when you look at Jesus through this lens, did he offer a more acceptable sacrifice than somebody else? Surely he did. Was he commended as being righteous? Did God commend him by accepting his gifts? Through his faith, though he died, does he still speak? Now, part of the reason that this is pretty interesting, and there's at least a connection, think about this in Hebrews chapter 13. It's at the end of chapter 12, here in verse 24. Somebody read for us chapter 12 and verse 24. Okay. Okay, so when he looks at Abel, Abel is just an example. It's just a foreshadowing, ultimately, of Jesus. And we've seen this foreshadowing concept, like with the priesthood, with the tabernacle, with all of these different arguments, all these different people throughout the book. And so again, I just want you to look at it. Again, you may say, well, I don't know, but maybe as we go through and you look at the section more, maybe there will be some details that will help. So let's look here at, we're going to pick up here with the story of Enoch, but just for kind of rehashing everything, I want us to read again our section here, verses 1 down through verse 16. So again, we're moving into this section on models of faith and the encouragement to live faithfully. And we're right here looking to the future by faith, and we're really kind of summarizing most of the book of Genesis. So somebody go ahead and read for us again, verse 1 down through verse 16.
Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous. God commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still believed. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as righteous to God. And without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events he had yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them, and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city.
Okay. All right. So as we read through this section, basically what I want us to do is to look at each person, talk about their story and their faith, and then also show some about how this points to Jesus, and then let's talk about applications that come out of that. So we've seen that some already with Abel, but let's talk about the story of Enoch. Okay? What do we know about Enoch here in verse 5? And I guess obviously in other places. It's not the only place he's talked about. Yeah, he didn't see physical death. And so I think he had 365 years, I think is how long it was. And then he was just taken up. What was said about him? Yeah, he walked with God. You know, it was kind of funny. I was reading some commentary or something, but he was talking about, Enoch basically taking his daily walk with God. And at one point, instead of Enoch going back to his house, God's saying, hey, why don't you just come to my house? And that's basically how it was. They had just a relationship that was so close. And it's a very, very special thing. But again, as we look at the argument here with the Hebrew writer, how did Enoch walk with God in such a way, in such a careful, consistent, I've only been alive 36 years. He went 10 times that, and yet that's the description. How did he do that, though, from this text? Yeah, yeah. He pleased God. He did it by faith, right? He trusted Him. He had a relationship with Him. And so he's listening to His Word, and he's obviously walking with Him. But yet, isn't the story of Enoch a little strange? I mean, how many people have what happened to Enoch happen to them? Yeah, Elijah's kind of the only one that's sort of even in that kind of similar category. And so, of course, his was a little different, but still kind of the same idea. And so God took him, and now he was taken. And here's what was said about him before he was taken: it was that he was commended as having pleased God. Now, when we look at that, that's an amazing story. Now, let's talk about Jesus. Does this sound like Jesus? Let's say you go through and you kind of do a juxtaposition. You put Jesus' name in there. Does it sound like him? It doesn't sound like Jesus?
The resurrected Jesus, yeah.
It does sound like the resurrected Jesus, right? That he was taken up. Well, that's true. That is true. So I guess it depends on part of it, right? But the idea of him being, before he's taken up, it pleases him. But again, part of the idea is that Enoch is helping us understand that when God does this with Jesus, it's not outside of what God has done before, of taking someone with him, right? And so it's still, again, the same idea. Now, what then should we learn? What should we gain from this? What is his point for us? Yeah. And that's really, again, based off of the whole argumentation of everything that God has done and everything that He's wanting from us. He's just wanting this relationship, to stay with Him. And what is true of Enoch and what is true of Jesus can be true of us, right? That's the ultimate goal, is that it's not just that it's said about Enoch, or not just that it's said about Jesus, but that it is about Jacob, it's about Jeremy, it's about Steve, it's about every one of us having this description of one that has pleased God. But again, how does that come about? It comes about by confidence. It comes by this assurance, this conviction that God is and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. Okay? Right? Yeah. 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 That's a good. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, the unjustness of all of that, and that God is with them. God's faithful. And again, that's going to be really important. Remember his argument as we go through each of these different ones. There's some people that are going to be murdered. Some people that, hey, their life went really smoothly and things are pretty great. A lot of people, they left their family and their homeland. And you have all of this kind of a spectrum, but they're all doing fundamentally the same thing. They're all believing in God. They're all having conviction. And that's what's important for the Hebrew writer. As we talked about going back to chapters 3 and 4, that they didn't enter into that land because of unbelief. And that's the evil, unbelieving heart that's creeping in. He's making sure that that's not happening in that church. And here's just, again, signposts to say, look, you have all of these people that have done it this way before, and we want to follow that same pattern. Okay, what else do we want to say about Enoch? We're kind of working through this section. But well, let's talk about Noah then. So what do we know about Noah from Old Testament and also this text? Oh, sure.
Have it by faith, so it's and then something like almost like a point made off of it with Abel.
Mm-hmm.
You have it kind of and Enoch kind of stands on both through his faith, so he died so he's been on Enoch. It's a point about maybe having to believe that he exists and reward those who seek him. And then on Noah,
Mm-hmm.
That he became an heir of righteousness. Almost like each of them got a little bit of a specific point to make about it.
Right.
About his knowledge of Enoch, but in the time that Enoch is living, he's somebody that where Noah and somebody who believes that God exists and that he will be a rewarder of those who seek him and he will ultimately have a reward.
Yeah. This one is showing faithfulness in the past, but it's helping us to better understand just how great Jesus is. Like Enoch was great, Abel was great, but each of them they're just shadows helping us to understand. And one of the things that's not always appreciated about Enoch, but it is mentioned in Peter's, is that he had a prophecy. He was a prophet at that time, and actually he was one of the people that condemned the world and talked about how God was going to bring judgment on that type of behavior. And so, again, you just have all of these different things that are, again, part of the argument of the Hebrew writer, but also just they're helping us to better understand just how great Jesus is. You have more that you want to add on that? Okay. Anything else about Enoch? All right, well, let's talk about Noah then. So the text says that he was warned by God concerning events as yet unseen. In reverent fear, constructed an ark. So again, Jesus obviously didn't make an ark. As far as told, and by this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Now, Noah is an exceptional individual. We can go back there and read his story, and it's especially important, obviously, for this audience where they might be, a remnant of people that are faithful. Noah's story is so important. But what do we learn about Noah that is that you think is important, that's beneficial as it relates to his argument here? Yeah, he found grace. Yeah. One of the things that I haven't always appreciated is the amount of people that were back there. I mean, you have, obviously, they're just trying to estimate. But one of the estimates that I had seen was they had estimated something like 1 billion people were alive during the days of Noah. I mean, there was a lot of people that were alive. And yet he was one of the few that were still righteous. Of course, obviously, that's not material. But the idea is not just, oh, there was 30 people and Noah did okay. I mean, there was a lot of people there. And so he's still exceptional among that generation. What else? What else do we learn about Noah? Go ahead. Yeah. Hmm. Right. Yeah, it was about understanding who God was and what God was going to bring. So I mean, there's it's both sides of it, right? I mean, he believes and wants to save himself, but he also understands God is going to do what he's going to do, and I need to respect that. Let me come over here and then or finish and then. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Ed. Yeah. But I think, again, based off of what we've seen already, God doesn't just call on us to just believe things without evidence. Like he could have gone through and said, well, okay, I don't know what rain looks like, but I know this world got here somehow, and it's a lot harder to bring this world into existence than it is to bring water down. You know? But still, to your point, it's faith. It's seeing something that he has not seen before, but it's because he's convicted based on what God said about it. Go ahead, what were you going to say? Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, he makes the point about baptism in 1 Peter 3 that there is a connection of a safe place that has been prepared by him, that in that moment it's pretty interesting. In the same thing that condemns the world, it's also how someone is saved, and and through that action as well, that obviously Jesus in this case would be the heir of righteousness, but anybody that's there is the same concept. Um, Again, that's what I want you to see. It's not just because we can kind of read this linearly and just think, oh, that's great about Noah. But again, I want us to see that Jesus is so much greater. He's doing the same kind of things, maybe not exactly the same, but on an even greater level. What else do we want to say about Noah? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 So it's just replaying the same thing with Noah, and what you're saying about how we have these things in the future. In case we want to look at another place where Peter uses Noah, it's 2 Peter 3. He says, how do we know that there's going to be a destruction of the world in the future? Look back at Noah. It happened. God heard it. He believed it. And we're in the exact same situation. We're looking to that time, and we're trusting in Him that ultimately there's salvation. But it's the same fundamental principles. But it's important, I think, for the argument in Hebrews, because we might look and say, well, how come God hasn't brought everything that He said He was going to bring? How come He hasn't done what I'm anticipating or behaved the way that I want Him to? And yet, if you go back and you read the stories of the Old Testament, you would say, well, I mean, He did it with Noah, He did it with Enoch. Why do I expect Him to be different now? And still have to have this same faith and to believe in that same way. What else do we want to say about Noah? Oh, go ahead. I got you. Go ahead, Miss Norma. Ladies first. Hmm. Yeah. 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 By faith, right? That's the whole idea. By faith, you have these various aspects that it causes someone to behave in a very different, even rejected according to the culture way, because they believe something. They're believing what God has said about it. Go ahead. What were you going to say, Pete? Well, I think it took him 100 years. So. Right. Sure. Yeah, exactly. I'm sure they thought he was totally crazy. But again, that's so important for the argument about the Hebrew writer and about what they have in Christ. It's not saying, okay, because you're having hard times, God doesn't care about you, save you, aren't going well, God's rejected you. That's not the argument at all. It's that they're enduring all of this difficulty, but they have to listen to God. They have to keep the faith during that difficulty. Well, let's talk about Abraham a little bit here. And so, verse 8, that he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, went out not knowing where he was going. And there's multiple statements here. He lived in the land of promise as in a foreign land, which is kind of a strange dichotomy. He lived in tents with Isaac and Jacob. And then it says in verse 10 that he was looking to the city that has foundations and whose designer and builder is God. Okay, so what about Abraham? What is so important about his story? Yeah. Promised land. Doesn't feel like the promised land here. Yeah. Yeah. But again, this goes back to what he said in Hebrews 3 and 4. Here's this rest, this ultimate rest that is ahead, that's what he's looking for, that ultimately is allowing him to live in the upside down, hard circumstances of the present moment. But what else? What else do you want to say about Abraham? Go ahead. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mentioned the inheritance was mentioned in chapter 2, and I got about as close as I could without actually being in the right spot. It's chapter 1, verse 14. Of those that would inherit salvation, that's you and me who are going to inherit salvation. And so we should put ourselves in this same category. But again, even though he's going to receive this inheritance, he doesn't even know what it's going to be like. There's so much that he's like, okay, I know it's there, I understand that, but yet uh, he goes and he gets part of it, but he doesn't get the full understanding of it. And he's got this strange dichotomy of living in tents with these other heirs of this same promise here. So there's a lot to this in the sense of just appreciating what Abraham has done. Verse 10, look at what grounded him, what allowed him to stay in the tent. He never built a house, guys. Never. I mean, it's amazing what he did. Never built a house, but he's looking for something that he's never seen before. And it's a city that its foundations and foundations have been designed and built by God. Now, this city we want to see a little bit later is Jerusalem, is what he talks about. The heavenly Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem, is the way he talks about it there in chapter 12. It's talked about in Isaiah and also in Revelation. But this is not a house or a city that he made himself or someone else made. It's something that's made by God. And that's what he's looking for. That's a permanent dwelling place. So all of those things are true. What else do we want to say about Abraham? I mean, we'll have another opportunity. He's going to say a little bit more about him, but do y'all see Jesus in this at all? The not knowing where he was going, maybe not. He obviously knew where he was going. Yeah, he wandered around like a stranger. He was going to inherit the nations, and Psalm 2 talks about, the world and the nations were going to be his, those ideas. But what were you going to say? Yeah. So, I mean, he is going to inherit them, and he's there living in the land, right? But do they operate like Jesus is the king and he's going to inherit everything? It's the exact opposite. And so, again, there's a lot of these ideas that help us not only to just appreciate how great Abraham was, but just how much greater Jesus is. Is that he's not just there with, anyway, I'm just going to leave that thought. But it's just the same idea. But again, what about for us? How do we live like Abraham? How do we give up the pleasures of the world? How do we give up our comforts, our family? I mean, he went to a place he'd never been before, and it wasn't like, hey, I'm going to go back and see my family every couple of weeks. It just wasn't like that. I mean, the closest we have is probably Richard, right? I mean, coming from South Africa, he's a long way, not able to just kind of go back whenever he wants to. He can Zoom call, I guess, or something like that. It's a little different. But how do we live like strangers in a place that we enjoy, but is trying to pull us away from God? Yeah. Keep verse 10 in our minds. Right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, just think about how many amazing cities are in the world, and then just realize they're nothing compared to the city of God. Go ahead. Right. Yeah. 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 And even his faith. Does he really believe? You're going to give up your wife. Do you really believe God's going to take care of you? And yeah. Yeah. And that will be the end of this argument in chapter 11, is about what God does with people to form them. So go ahead. What were you going to say? Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean he'll make that point actually in chapter 13. Here he says, "For we have let me see if I can say it again. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come." Very much he's going to apply it to us. But I mean, there's something to be said about wanting a place where you're comfortable, wanting a piece of property that you own, a city that you own, all of those kind of things. And his point is, it's not going to be here. It's going to be obviously there in that heavenly Jerusalem. What else? Go ahead. Yeah, I think there's only one other time, and it might have been Enoch. But you're right. It's a rare description. Somebody can Google that for me. Yeah. Yeah. So there is something to be said there too. Well, let's talk about Sarah here for just a minute. So Sarah, she received power to conceive even when she was past the age. And here goes to part of the point I was thinking about, Emily. Since she considered him faithful who had promised, it's not just a matter of is there evidence. It's also based in the character of God. Is he one that has always come through? He has, and that's part of why we're going through this. But he says, therefore, from one as good as dead were born descendants as many as the stars of and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Okay. Now, Sarah kind of, again, you look at the Genesis account, she's kind of up and down as well. But, I mean, here's some great statements about her. What do we learn about Sarah and, by connection, Abraham here in 11 and 12? Yeah. She had no idea how that was going to happen. Yeah. I mean, you're 90, so that's all. Just that's how old she was. So, it's just one of those things. Just take God at His word. Sounds good. Sounds good. Let's stop right there. Oh, so amazing power in this man. Him as good as dead. So it's not even just her. He obviously had problems, and yet here's the descendants as innumerable as the grains of sand. Amazing concept. But what do we learn about Jesus though? About this story? Any of this sound like Jesus? Yeah. Yeah, that is true. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, she went. She didn't say, "Hey, you're going on your own." She went with him. It was her family she was leaving as well. That's a good point. Right? Yeah. 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 Yeah, I think what he's doing in a sense is he's like making connections that the story didn't necessarily make. He's saying, here's what motivated them to behave the way that they were operating. With the only one, I guess the only exception you might have of this is Abraham, where Genesis 15 says that he believed God. So you can't really get around that one, but that's the, yeah. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, in the way that, sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Well, it's just, I guess the main thing is that God spoke to them in some way. And because God spoke, they believed it, and that was enough. And that's the main, those things are going together. Go ahead, Bill, and then I'll come over. Right. Yeah. Sure. Oh, yeah. That's his whole point, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. And that's his argument earlier is to don't just drift away and have this inability to hear. You have plenty of evidence, and that's really that's kind of the summation of his point in 12 is look at what all of God has done already. Go ahead, Andrew. What were you going to say? Yeah, yeah. Well, let me tell you how I see Jesus here, and you can either disagree or not. But receiving the power to conceive, Sarah's story is pretty amazing. It's nothing compared to Mary. Mary's story is totally different. It's one thing to have the biological father, mother, and bodies breaking down. It's different to not even have a father at all. And then further, one man that was as good as many descendants are born to him. That's Isaiah 53, guys, where he talks about off from the land of the living, but he will see his offspring. That's the nation that comes from it. So there's just some amazing concepts that are all there. But let's summarize verses 13 through 16. We only got a couple of minutes. I'm going to use this, or I'll let Nathan take care of this as a transition on Sunday. But look at what he says. Here's the summation so far. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear they are seeking homeland. For if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So again, here's this city concept, not receiving the promises. They see them, they greet them, but yet they're strangers and exiles. And he says there in verse 14, the people that speak like this, what's clear about them? What are they doing? What are they interested in? Yeah, home. Home's not here. Right? Home is in this city that he's describing. And it doesn't matter. You can go all over the world. You'll never find home. But think about what he says, though, in verse 15. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, if this is what their home was, they had an opportunity to go back. I mean, Abraham could have gone back. He could have gone back home. Isaac, Jacob, whoever the case is, all of these chance to go back home, but that's not what they were wanting. And again, as Austin was talking about earlier, it's not about a piece of real estate over there. It's that it's not the real estate doesn't have God. It's not God's city. God's not dwelling there. And so you have this this concept of wanting this better country there in verse 16. But I want to mention this before we end. He says, though, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. There's a couple of things there. Why is God not ashamed to be called their God? Yeah, because they believed him and they obeyed him. And that's a pretty amazing thing. Do you ever feel like do you ever feel ashamed of yourself or other people are ashamed of you? I mean, anytime, if you're real about it, yeah, we feel that way. But think about this. He's not ashamed to be called their God. Again, it's not because they don't deserve it or because there's something wrong. It's because of who it is. It's that God is that they believe. Richard and then Austin, and then we're done. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then Jesus doing that on a cosmic level, right? I mean, even greater than Abraham. But Hebrews 2 makes the same point that Jesus isn't ashamed to call us brethren, which is an amazing concept. Go ahead. What were you going to say? Right. Yeah. Yeah. And in Ezekiel, as well as all the prophets, guess what Ezekiel ends with? An amazing city. It's always there. Isaiah, Ezekiel, and the prophets. So, all right, we'll stop right there, and Nathan will pick up there, probably talk a little bit about that, and then verse 17.